Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, An Ethical Approach to Compliance and Security. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. All of your lines have been muted to reduce background noise. Please feel free to shoot us questions throughout the presentation using the questions feature that is on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Today's presentation will be recorded, so if you have to step away from your desk, don't worry. We'll send out the full recording after the conclusion of today's live broadcast. I see a few folks are still joining, but we want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know you've all set aside a full hour for us, and we very much appreciate that. So let's get started. We've got a great roster of experts for this discussion today. Our moderator will be John Birchfield, President of North America Data Solutions at Logility. So let's begin. John?
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone. Really excited to have you with us today. We're covering an important topic, which is dealing with creating a culture of excellence as it relates to compliance and ethics, which can be so pervasive throughout the organization and really needs to be a critical linchpin of how an organization operates. And I'm joined today by two very distinguished panelists, Carlos Provencio, somebody I've known for many, many years, and Carlos is the Associate General Counsel at Interactive Brokers, LLC. That is the largest electronic trading platform in the United States. And Carlos manages all of their arbitration. He first chairs their litigation cases, handles enforcement matters, oversees all the company's e-discovery processes, a real full breadth of responsibilities there that gives him a nice purview into the most critical areas where ethics and compliance really need to be paid attention to. Additionally, he's argued in some heavy arbitrations, done over 50 arbitrations before things like FINRA, just a well-rounded, a very experienced and very well-regarded industry professional. And Carlos, we're glad to have you with us today. He is joined by Eduardo Provencio, and if you're wondering, no, the last names are not coincidence, they are brothers. And they come from, as we were just talking about a moment ago, a very high-achieving family. Eduardo is the general counsel for Mary's Brands. He's been there for a little over 4 years now, and Mary's Brands is, of course, involved with the cannabis and hemp-derived products, which is a really rapidly growing space. And he handles all legal matters associated with it, as well as handling all internal legal operational efforts for both the MMT Technology Holdings and all of its affiliates. Before that, he had many years in private practice. And he also, I think most notably, he worked to represent tribal rights as it relates to water and land, and argued before state and federal courts over a really distinguished career. So Eduardo, good to have you with us today as well. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. This is, of course, not what we had planned for when we originally had the symposium lined up, but we're all dealing with this new world of quarantine. And so having to cancel the symposium this year from a physical perspective, but being able to be joined by you remotely so that we can enjoy the experiences and the insights that you have, again, I'm very appreciative. So let's just get started. And let's start off with, I think, a real foundational question, which is, why does this matter? What is at stake as it relates to creating this culture of excellence and ethics in your information governance organization?
Go ahead, Carlos.
Start with you, Carlos.
Thank you. One of the things that is similar between Eduardo's company, Mary's Brands, and Interactive Brokers is that we both come from highly regulated industries. Specifically with regard to document retention and e-discovery and preservation and things like that, Interactive Brokers is regulated by the SEC and by FINRA, the CFTC, and various exchanges. And of course, we're international, so regulators around the world. And so, it's incumbent on us to meet obligations with regard to just regulatory requirements. We have to maintain documents in multiple formats. They have to be, non-erasable. And so just executing basic things like that are important. But it also falls into, I do a lot of arbitration and litigation. How do you prove your case? How do you meet your ethical duties of vigilance or diligence? And, what kind of representations are you making to, the tribunals? You're saying, we're producing documents. Well, can you actually produce documents? And so, if you want to avoid regulatory fines, regulatory sanctions, if you want to avoid arbitration litigation sanctions. You got to be on top of these things.
And of course, for you, as you're saying, you've got so many state differences, but also international regulatory differences. Managing each of those regulatory body requirements, that's a full-time challenge in and of itself. How have you handled that with the growing number of regulations that we're seeing globally?
So we are very much in contact with our colleagues in England and Zug and Hong Kong. We've learned very quickly how to deal with GDPR issues. We have state privacy issues arise from time to time, but what really seems to be a big challenge, I think, is knowing how to, for instance, we have a lot of clients that will have accounts in multiple jurisdictions. We have clients who are in foreign countries that have accounts in the United States. If they are requesting documents in an arbitration, related to other accounts, how do you comply with that? And so part of it is getting to know the things yourself, so that way you are ethically and legally competent. Part of it is knowing who knows the information, so colleagues in London and Zug and wherever else, Zug, Switzerland. And of course, if you are using vendors, they are frequently the experts on the area, and so we rely on that. I mean, I don't know how many times I've contacted folks at Legility, like Austin Maddox or Andy Branham, or with questions. So it's not necessarily rocket science, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so Eduardo, kind of following up on that from your perspective, what are the risks that you see associated with this within your organization? There's a lot at stake here, particularly when you're a burgeoning industry that didn't exist before. So what kinds of challenges and risks are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of conceptually from our perspective, this industry, John, to your point, is incredibly new. And this industry, unlike already well-established regulated industries, the regulatory agencies are actually looking to the stakeholders for guidance as well. So it was imperative for a company like ours that that was one of the first movers in the space, and now considered one of the more one of the larger players in the space, to secure a reputation of being ethical, of wanting to be kind of faithfully compliant, of working closely with the stakeholders. There are three real tenets that we've tried to employ here, and at least when I started with the company 4 years ago, I tried to make it a mission. One is to be the adult in the room, so to speak, which is particularly with a startup, and particularly being marijuana and cannabis in particular, you get a spectrum of people that are that are entering the space. A lot of people were operating illicitly prior to this state legalized market emerging. So they were coming out of the woodwork, which created a lot of skepticism, obviously, from the regulatory side. But we made our mission to be the adult in the room. We also made it our mantra to do things the right way, just not the quick way. Again, it's doing things in the spirit of kind of regulatory compliance, and to that matter as well. And we hear this a lot because a lot of the relative uncertainty between the state and federal conflicts. There's a lot of mimicry that goes on, where you have people, again, who are looking to cut corners and say, hey, I see company X or company Y do this. I think we should be able to do it as well. And when in reality, it's probably not the most ethical way, maybe not the most compliant way to do things. So we made it kind of our mission as well to say, listen, we're going to be the trendsetters here. We're going to be the one that actually establishes the best practices for our industry. And we're not going to be the follower, because we've been thrust into that role, or we want to be thrust into that role as one of the larger, more, one of the, I guess, the leading thinkers in the space.
No, Eduardo, I love that. I think that's such a great point, because there is this industry best practice standard that can be established across any industry, and you'll see folks follow suit. So if this particular practice is standard across all of my competitors, my customers are expecting it, over time that gets adopted and becomes the standard. With this nascent industry, the ability to set those ethical trends, to create and sort of be the thought leader in that direction. I think that's a great perspective. And you touched on something there as well. You said that, you know, when you're creating this culture of compliance and you have issues that occur, it affects your brand, it affects your reputation. And that brand and reputation is not just with the consumer or the broader market. You can create a brand or a reputation with the regulators themselves. So the issue of repeat non-compliance can establish a certain reputation for your organization. Carlos, I think that's the point that you had as well. You know, why is it so important that we look at this not just from the perspective of you know, avoiding regulatory issues, but then if we've had one, if there's a non-compliance issue somewhere, that these risks can be exacerbated for us?
Sure. Every regulatory matter that gets to the level of enforcement. So you know, in the securities industry, you have constant examination by your regulators, essentially a type of audit. And if they highlight or determine that there is an issue, you try and resolve it with them. If you can't resolve it, sometimes they will start an enforcement action. Enforcement actions end generally with it's called an AWC, an acceptance, waiver, and consent. It's essentially a consent decree. And the thing they always discuss, the regulators always discuss in those AWCs, what's your history? Is this something that they've been on you about in the past? Have you had other regulatory issues? And so, you know, it works. There are two effects to that. One is your credibility with the regulators in terms of, you know, a promise you make to resolve something. You know, they will credit you with that ability and the trust to work it out. And then the second thing is your penalties just get much worse. Your fines are higher. You know, your sanctions will be higher if you're a repeat offender. One of the things that FINRA has been working hard. You know, we're a completely electronic broker dealer. We don't have brokers sitting in an office, you know, telling, you know, you to, you know, buy Apple or sell whatever else. So it's not as big an issue for us, but in the industry, it's a big issue if you are a broker that has a few dings on your record. And there's actually a big movement now to try and clean the industry up and get rid of brokers with multiple issues. So reputationally, I guess let me add one other point. We are in a fairly small market. There aren't that many broker dealers like us that are sort of discount broker dealers, fully online. And so to the extent that we have an issue, you know, people will move their money, particularly with millennials. They'll move their money to, you know, a Schwab or a TD Ameritrade or E-Trade or whatever. And so we protect our reputation, you know, vigilantly.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I think that's a really good baseline for us. I mean, everyone understands compliance issues, ethics issues, they create risk across the board, whether they're litigation risks, financial risks, regulatory penalties, reputational damage, whether it's a well-established industry or a nascent one. Those risks are huge. So that really leads us to the primary topic of the day, which is how do you build a culture of ethics and compliance within the organization? And Eduardo, you touched a little bit on this in terms of setting that best practice standard, but what would be your sort of key points around how you begin to build a culture of ethics within the organization?
I mean, part of it, especially from a startup perspective as well, it's creating affiliations or forging relationships with vendors that you trust. You know, one of the common trends that you've seen in this industry is when this industry got off the ground here in Colorado back in 2012 with passage of adult use legalization. One of the kind of gaping holes in kind of industry practices was that there's really no way to bank. So it's a very, very cash heavy business. And that created issues of vulnerability, right? So there were issues of identifying new employees because everyone had new employees. No one no one was coming from another company yet because this industry is brand new. What do? So what standards do you put in place for hiring practices? And you really build it from the ground up. Originally in this industry, you were hiring people that you trusted, and then you were basically training them in the way that you thought that they could help your organization. Just because you knew that they were going to be around a lot of product that still had a lot of black market attraction, a lot of cash that was difficult to track. But truly from every hire that our organization made, you were building basically some metrics for what you're looking at from your employees. And from the vendor perspective, again, you were looking at vendors that you felt were doing it appropriately and who were probably going to grow with you, not because of you. So you tend to forge these relationships, and I will use legal as a good example. Early on, there were very, very few law firms willing to dip their toes in the water, in part because a lot of the bar associations had not really taken a position on whether or not attorneys were even allowed to represent cannabis companies in the state where it was state legal to sell cannabis. So you were truly relying upon some of these boutique firms that decided to represent the space that really desperately needed it. And now, obviously, 8 years later, a lot of the big firms, the big law firms, are now very interested in it because there's been some cover, some sort of regulatory cover. And for us, it's a question of loyalty. It's a question of still utilizing these folks that have grown with you, that have helped draft the regulations, that have helped build your business. Despite the allure of some of these larger firms that may just be getting into it, and by all accounts are great firms, but they just don't have the experience. So for us, I think it's a partnership within the industry, and it's creating and molding your workforce according to what you view as kind of an ethical workplace that can work within very, very tight regulations.
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, I think the entire idea that compliance and ethics is about a lot more than policy and process. It's about the people. It's about the team that you build and the sort of the net that you cast in terms of who you're introducing into that team. And before I go, I'm going to come to you here in just a second, Carlos. Before I do that, I want to make sure all of our attendees are also aware you can ask questions during the course of today's webinar. We'll have hopefully some Q&A time at the end as well, but you have the ability within your GoToMeeting window to pop a question to us, and that will be sent to us through chat. So we may get to some of those questions during the course of today's discussion. Now, Carlos, coming back to you, again, very, very different industries. Whereas you've got this, fertile soil, no pun intended there, Eduardo, that his industry is in. Whereas you've got heavy regulatory financial requirements that are well sort of calcified and critical. How do you go about building a culture of ethics and compliance in that kind of organization?
So there's sort of a combination. I think something that Eduardo said rings true, that trust in hiring. We actually give every applicant a predictive index test, which is sort of a psychological evaluation of what type of employee they would be. I don't know that it is that effective with regard to ethics, but we also have a incredibly stringent interviewing process. And one of the things that Eduardo mentioned was sort of some metrics, and ethics are tough to measure. And so one of the things that you have to look at, I think, is what kind of, or are people meeting their obligations, right? Are they living up to their pay grade? Are they living up to their responsibilities? Are they? And so we will track that pretty closely. I mean, look, we're all electronic, and so it's pretty easy to tell what people are doing all day, every day. I don't know that they track it very closely in terms of you've logged on this many times or whatever else, but we do track production in terms of particularly in the era of quarantine, you know, it's people, in our company, everyone's still being paid. Everyone's still working, 80% working from home. But there are challenges to productivity. There are challenges to efficiency. And so,
Sure.
one of the ways that you sort of measure whether people are living up to their expectations, and it's not just a business standpoint. Again, this is, we have people that are reviewing compliance issues. We have to know that we are meeting compliance obligations. We have customer service callers coming in, and so we have to have people fielding those calls, turning the issues around. Lawyers are getting busier and busier with complaints and with arbitrations and lawsuits, and so we do track that to some extent. So there's accountability there. People knowing that they're accountable, I think, matters with regard to ethics. The other thing is that buy-in from the top is important. And I'll give an example. We are a firm that generally, so we were founded by a Hungarian gentleman, Thomas Peterfi, 40 some years ago. Came to the country with nothing and has built the largest trading platform in the country. He came from communist country, comes to America, is a true believer in America, and I think his big idea is there's right and wrong. And so we tend not to settle a lot of cases. When we're right, whether it's economically prudent to maybe pay $10,000 to settle a case that's more expensive, a lot of times we don't do that. Just recently, though, we had an issue with negative oil prices, and our system couldn't handle them, and it became big news. And the CEO or founder, Mr. Peterfi, got online, or he's on CNBC, and immediately said, it's a programming issue, and we're paying everybody. Well, with certain limitations. I won't characterize how he said it. And, I'm not saying that you are paying everybody, but whatever. There are parameters of who's getting paid, but taking full responsibility for all those people within those parameters, and we're doing it. It's $105 million, and so I see it in our company from top down. There is buy-in now. For ethics buy-in, and I'll cut it off in a second. But one thing that gets harder is that things like e-discovery that are important to us, or things like certain document compliance issues, it's a little bit harder to get buy-in into that because they don't see it as a major risk until it becomes a major risk. And so, I think buy-in from the top, accountability, and then the last thing is you got to train the people. And it's hard to train up, but we are training down for sure, and trying to get executives to buy in as well.
No, I think that's fantastic, and I wanted to spend just a moment on training in a second. We have a lot to get through today. I knew we would not have enough time for all that I want to talk to you gentlemen about. But that story that you told there, I just think that's so powerful because really for two reasons. One, you have the backdrop of an organization which takes a very strong stand when they feel like, as an organization, you have a strong argument of being right. That there is maybe a little less of a propensity to settle for convenience than there might be in other organizations. Well, that creates a real backdrop when the CEO does come forward and sort of unilaterally takes this very proactive step to recompense a certain number of your clients based on an issue that he clearly owns. That sets a standard for your whole company. That's something I've got to believe. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong. I've got to believe that employees talk about that, and it does influence how they behave.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly the lawyers who are used to fighting a lot of cases. I tried 4 myself last year. If you look at the FINRA awards for the year, almost no firms have 7 or 8 awards. We frequently do because we just don't settle the cases that we feel that we're right on. So we were curious to see, what would happen with this, and he stepped up quickly and on CNBC and said, "We're taking care of it." And the clients appreciate that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Look, I want to spend just another moment on hiring because we have a question that I think is a good one. And I want to talk about training again briefly, and I want to move on to some of our other topics. So a question came in from one of our attendees asking, and this is really for either of you, to describe tangibly some of the best practices for hiring excellence versus hiring for ethics. You referred to that earlier, and I think some of the folks are curious what that looks like tangibly. And then separately, is that ever in conflict for you, hiring for excellence versus hiring for ethics?
Yeah, listen, so from our perspective, again, this is from a kind of a startup illicit market, federally illicit market perspective. There was a real pivot about 3 years ago now, where hiring practices really moved outside of the cannabis industry itself, and the idea was, and that's right around there was a lot of public money coming into the industry, and there was hiring happening, at least for a company like ours, that's a CPG company, from some of these larger CPG players. A good example is our COO here at Mary's. We hired away from Hain Celestial, which is the Celestial Seasonings. He previously worked for Frito-Lay and Pepsi. In terms of, and I think this is where the ethics and the excellence really come hand in hand. When we hired him, we brought him in to shore up our best practices for our manufacturing operation on both our hemp and marijuana sides. But it's one of those things where while we're not regulated by the FDA, for instance, just because at the federal level we're still viewed as illegal, we are implementing practices that would be otherwise compliant with FDA best practices, GMP or CGMP type practices, for a couple of reasons. One, consumer confidence, right? I mean, the fact that we can say that we're not necessarily GMP certified, but we're certainly GMP compliant, is a huge opportunity marketing feature. I think that plays into both the excellence and the ethics piece, but also it just prepares us. I mean, again, I think everyone's trying to get their pieces in place for when the federal government finally listens to the majority of the states that want legalized cannabis to say, listen, we know it's going to happen, and we know one of the necessary elements of that legalization is going to be compliance with FDA regulations, most likely. So if we're there already, then that transition is going to be seamless for us. So that's been a huge strategy in this industry, and I think that's one of the main reasons why there was a lot of public money that actually came into the space 2-3 years ago, is because there was a mainstream acceptance from employees at very reputable companies that were willing to dip their toes in the water of cannabis.
Yeah, that makes it. Carlos, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question highlights sort of a tension that exists sort of broadly, but in my mind, it shouldn't really exist in hiring. In that, we give an exam to every applicant as well, not just the predictive index, but we make them show us basic math skills and logic skills and knowledge of the security industry, and those things are important. For the lawyers that we try and hire, we look to see if they can write, if they have experience, in the courtroom, if they can pick up the subject matter pretty well. But it doesn't do you any good to write a beautiful brief if you're going to get stuck, because you didn't, shepherdize the things, or you made misrepresentations, or you didn't verify, the facts. The beautiful language doesn't get you past the ethical issue there. And so it's not easy necessarily to identify someone who is more ethical than someone else. But I think you have to look at references. You have to look at, did they work at places that were ethical? I mean, there are certain law firms that I probably would not hire from because I feel they are perhaps too aggressive. There are, and the same, this goes with vendors as well. There are vendors that I've worked with who will fight for every dollar and fight to get you efficiency, but sometimes, the dollar is not the last, the ultimate measure. And so we tend to work with vendors, Logility included, that that we know will do the right thing, that will step up when we need them. And even if they're, a lot of vendors, have metrics to say how effectively they work, but there are plenty of quotes about doing the right thing when it's easy, but how do you do the right thing when it's hard? And that's what we're looking for.
No, that's dead on. And, just to reflect briefly, I appreciate your comments about Logility and, in keeping with ethics. I can't pay you for that comment, but thank you anyway. Yeah, do the right thing has long been our anchor core value. We have 4 core values, and do the right thing is our anchor core value. And it's got a tagline to it, which is especially when tempted to compromise. And, you find in most situations, very few people self-identify as dishonest. But the reality is when we're put in situations where there's something at risk, where there's tension, where there's a potential consequence that could arise from taking the honest or ethical approach, that is where you'll find occasionally that individuals and organizations will crack. And the more that you can keep that a consistent standard, we use similar things to what you've referenced in terms of tests and profiling. And I don't think there should ever be a conflict between ethics and excellence in your hiring process. Where I normally see that break down in organizations is when you have the need for rapid ramp up and insufficient pipeline of talent. And suddenly those standards, those gates that you've set because you're desperate to get help, they can drop. And so I think this really, it feeds into almost more of a process discussion, making sure you have good mechanisms in place and a bench, and you're anticipating what your roster needs, so you're not put in a situation where you need that talent so badly that you're tempted to compromise. So I think that's a really great topic. And Carlos, you said really the 3 things: leadership, which I could not agree more. Organizationally, if you flip that story around, if you had seen your CEO do something that was clearly unethical, it would have a hugely detrimental effect on the employees in terms of their own approach toward ethics. So you have to have that at the leadership level. And then it's hiring, as you both said so articulately. And then you mentioned training. And I don't want to bog down too long here, but training around ethics, security, compliance, every organization right now is going through this. But what could you tell us in terms of maybe some best practices that you've observed that can move the training process from something which is a banal exercise that people just go through to check the box to something which actually influences behavior? Really, for either one of you.
Well, one of the things that this is a John Birchfield favorite apparently, but the word integrity comes from integer, or same root as integer, meaning whole. And so I think it's important to really impart on your folks through training that, look, the system doesn't work unless everyone interacts in an ethical way. So if we are doing something on a trade on one side, someone on the other side is going to be the counterparty, and if you don't do it ethically, the system falls apart. The same with the legal system. If we can't rely on the other lawyer to make a representation, then the system falls apart. And so, in terms of training, I think one, you have to make sure that they're looking at not just the bottom line. It's important for all of us that we make money. That's what the businesses are for. But they have to know that you can't make money, and the broader system doesn't even work unless we all buy into it. The other thing is, I think that you have to give them specifics in terms of where the lines are. And so, with respect to with the lawyers, you end up having the 3 years of law school and years of experience, and you kind of work out the lines. But we have innumerable conversations throughout the week saying, I'm not sure if I read this correctly. I don't know that I want to necessarily produce something. What do you think? And someone else is helping you decide where that line is. And that's not sort of a formal training situation. It's more of an informal training situation. But to the extent that you have new young lawyers coming in or new young programmers coming in, they need to know sort of what the industry ethical line is and what the company ethical line is. And I think you have to be fairly explicit about that. The other thing you have to do is you have to have sort of a harmonized approach on this. It doesn't do me any good to hire Legility, because you guys are ethical, and the next lawyer over to hire, X company that is not ethical, because our name's still going to be on the issue, right? And so you have to have a harmonized approach. And so I've been pushing really hard internally to make sure that with respect to e-discovery in particular, and into firm retention, that we all get together and decide what are we looking for, and who are the players that we're going to deal with.
I think that's great. And I want to come back to that topic of sort of harmonization or consistency throughout different departments in the organization on the topic. But before I do that, Eduardo, anything that you would like to add on the subject of effective training, how you continue to foster this culture of ethics in an ongoing manner?
Yeah, the one thing that's unique about our industry, both on the hemp and marijuana sides, is that there's a certain element of shades of gray for the entire regulatory structure. Particularly on the hemp-derived product side, there's been a lot of movement federally with the 2018 Farm Bill passage that that kind of unequivocally legalized hemp and hemp extract, where there was some dispute between conflicting federal law for a while. But one of the large issues that has come up, as this is a good example, is that there have been a lot of these larger players have forged relationships with some of the big box retailers in order to get their hemp extract products, their hemp derived products into stores. But with that comes a lot of scrutiny. One of the issues that comes up frequently are issues of medical claims, where the FDA or even now the FTC has been getting involved. And recently, even with coronavirus, for the first time ever in this industry, the FTC actually filed a complaint against a CBD company in California for making unsubstantiated medical claims about their products being able to cure or actually mitigate the effect of coronavirus. I mean, it's just wildly unsubstantiated, a cheap marketing ploy to try to sell some product. So there are some of the larger players in that industry have received these letters from the FDA for issues regarding false medical claim. And even though that again, they're operating the shade of gray, where it's not necessarily approved by the FDA. The FDA is not removing product from the shelves, but they are trying to protect consumers, just making sure that there's no false information out there about the products. There are risks that are being taken by these larger companies to try to get the easy sell. And at our company, we've taken the position to not do that. We've never, knock on wood, we've never received a letter from the FDA about issues of false medical claim. But just recently, because of that, our pet line, our Mary's Tales line, we just signed. We're the first hemp extract company to be distributed in PetSmart, and the only reason why that happened is because of their view, and obviously their fear of retribution from any sort of federal regulatory body, saying, listen, we think you guys are ethical. We think you guys are going to do it the right way. You guys align with our philosophies. Now, what's happened, part of that, and this is actually where we've been fortunate, is that we've taken that position across all of our product lines. One of the things that we've seen happen is, you may have one product line that operates independently of another, but they are affiliated. So, your pet line may be very ethical and complying to the greatest extent that they can, but maybe your human line does not. And this is not a hypothetical. This has happened for a number of companies. So a company like PetSmart, while they may be happy with the products that they're carrying and what's being said about them as their vendor, they're not terribly happy about what you're saying about your human side, because to Carlos's point, they will get caught in the jet wash. The fact that they're affiliated with an affiliate of a company that may get some very, very bad publicity creates a huge issue. So it's important to, from our perspective, it's actually important to make sure those ethics lines are drawn across all brands, all companies, because it makes for cleaner transactions, and it makes for just a much more ethical, easier way, less headaches in terms of trying to make a name for yourself in the space.
That's excellent. Excellent. Well, good. I think that's a really good approach to that topic. And I want to kind of pivot now to this idea of harmonization within the organization. And even as that relates to both internal resources and vendors and others that you engage in the process with. And you started down this road a bit, Carlos. How do you, in an organization like yours, ensure that cyber and IT and records retention, that all of these different divisions within a corporation are on the same page and approaching the ethical standard in the same way? How are you creating that harmony within your organization?
That's a hard question. We started with, in 70, whatever year it was, 1970 something, with, one or two people just programming. And we've grown to about 800 programmers. About half of our, or a little more than half of our entire workforce are computer programmers. And they will work on certain things. And so the only way really to manage that, I think, you have to start with leadership. Everyone can, we all see our own little issues. So, I deal with e-discovery, and I'll see an issue with, how hard it is to get documents out of certain parts of the data map, for instance. And I can escalate that up, but until there's a real advocate or sponsor up high saying, all right, look, we have this issue with regard to programming, or maybe it's not an issue with programming, maybe it's an issue with training me or training vendors how to get documents out. But that's also then going to impact maybe the enforcement folks dealing with the regulators. It could also impact the folks in compliance with AML. And so you have to have a structure. And it's to some extent it might be a little easier in a more mature company. Say for instance, Eduardo's company is pretty young. They might not see the need to put in that kind of structure. But I think as you grow, you have to be thinking about that structure. You have to be thinking about, 10 years ago we had one compliance person because it was fine. And it's a hypothetical. 10 years on, now that you're, the second, third biggest player, you need more than 1 or 10 or 100 compliance people. You need whatever the number is to do it effectively. And so you have to have leadership, you have to have structure, and then you have to have communication. And it's, particularly in the time of coronavirus, when people are not at their desks, you have to find, cell phone numbers to contact people, or you have to use, Teams or whatever chat you're using to run people down. It's pretty hard to corral everybody to get these things done. So, effective communications is huge. Having a structure that grows with the company. People weren't thinking about money laundering as a major issue 10 years ago. It's a major issue for every broker dealer now, and I'm sure for cannabis companies. So to some extent try and manage up, but a lot of it has to do with how the company is willing to play along.
Well, no, I think that's a really good response. And if we could stay there for a second, and let's pivot to, with your external providers, you're over e-discovery. You see a host of issues associated with ethics and compliance around e-discovery. How do you separate and determine who you should be working with? How do you know whether it's outside counsel or a vendor that you're making those right selections as a partner?
So it's not a flawless process. We've hired outside counsel that were not a good fit in the past. I had a partner years and years ago who was one of the first Sedona conference folks, and so I learned pretty early from him that you have to have control when it comes to discovery and things like that. And so when I started at Morgan Keegan, I got control of, and we had 6 different law firms using 6 different platforms. and we ended up going, and this is where I got to meet you, John, going with Counsel on Call at the time and DSI, just because we needed a platform that everyone could work on. And so you have to get control. And so that was what I did at Interactive Brokers. They didn't have that much litigation, and people kind of dealt with it ad hoc. And I said, look, I've done this before. We need to harmonize this. And so what we did was we looked at everybody that the company had used and looked at recommendations of people that from outside counsel that they had used, and then folks that I was familiar with, and we gave them a proposal. They responded to the proposal. They came in, they interviewed. We went back and forth a bunch, and we essentially selected two firms that we felt were aligned with us. One firm actually has a ton of experience with our two major law firms, and so that was somewhat of a nod to the firms. But it was a matter of gaining trust, and then just doing research and listening to proposals. So
yeah, and that's always the tough part of the process, isn't it? Because anyone that you engage, they're going to espouse their level of ethics and service, and the proposals and the marketing materials, they all sound very similar. But when you have those connections, those references, or certainly when you have that experience and you've received that level of service, or you've seen that level of ethic demonstrated, that really trumps all. Anything
John,
else?
Sorry, go ahead. Can I jump in real quick? I'm just going to give you two practical examples of how we do this. And I know that you guys are a little bit bashful about me touting agility, but I'm going to do it anyway here. So two cases. One was we had a matter that there was an issue with the ingestion and processing of documents. It caused a huge delay in a regulatory response, and it cost an additional $50,000 to fix it. And a vendor came back and kind of dissembled about the blame and billed us for all the time. And when we went back to them, we had to fight for them, and they eventually gave us a bit of a discount on it, but it left a terrible taste in my mouth. Like I thought, that's not a vendor I ever want to work with. I had a matter, and it was it predated Legility, but it was DSI and Counsel on Call. We had a regulator say that we breached our privacy duties with respect to customer information, and based on a huge review. And it turned out there were two issues with the review. Before Counsel on Call knew anything about this, and before DSI knew anything about what the actual cause was, they said, we're going to take responsibility for this. We're going to find out, we're going to investigate, and we're going to fix it. It turns out that it was an in-house counsel kind of missed a batch. It was produced to an opposing counsel, who happened to then turn around and give it to someone else at the regulator. So it was a regulator's fault that there was a breach. But Counsel on Call and Legility, the successor company, stepped up right away. That's who I want to work with. I don't want to work with the other company that's charging me for their own mistake. Whether you own up to your mistake, to me is an ethical issue. So again, I apologize for the ad there, but it means something to me.
No, look, I appreciate that, and yeah, of course, we do try to steer away from those things. We're not trying to make this a commercial exercise, but I do appreciate the sentiment. And clearly, and this kind of relates to, I think, a topic we'll hit on with the last point. You don't really know what either an individual or an organizational ethical stance is going to be until they're put in the posture where they have to prove it. And that, I think, speaks volumes, irrespective of the organization or the individual or what the industry is. It really crosses all. So, it's hard to believe we're already getting up here on the last few minutes of our time. This hour has absolutely flown by. I want to remind our attendees, if you have any questions, you can pop those in the chat window here. We'll call this last few minutes our Q&A session, but I'm going to keep peppering these guys with questions during it because I've got a lot more I want to ask. I think obviously topically we're all dealing with the reason that we're on a conference call today instead of together in Nashville at the symposium in April. What are you seeing the effect be on organizations as it relates to ethics and compliance in a post-coronavirus world? And I'll really go to either of you. Eduardo, I haven't come to you in a minute. Maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange world, particularly in the CPG type space. We've been fortunate that the marijuana industry in nearly every state, I think, except Massachusetts, that has legalized marijuana, that at least the medical marijuana industry was considered an essential service. That actually wasn't the case early on. Believe it or not, when Mayor Hancock here in Denver, when he announced the initial stay-at-home order, liquor stores and dispensaries were not on that list, and it resulted in a flood of consumers going to buy their
pitchforks and torches.
Exactly, yeah, their booze and weed apparently before they were going to be locked into their homes, which quickly resulted in, within 2 hours, literally within 2 hours, Mayor Hancock changing his position. But for us, it's important because we look at it a few ways. We're one of the first organizations, both inside or outside marijuana, in the city of Denver to implement some sort of modified stay-at-home order, even before the city had done it. We had meetings. We actually put together a COVID emergency response team that, it's our chief science officer, myself, and ops HR director as well, to put some ideas in place because we knew it was coming. We just didn't know when. And literally, the meeting occurred. I'll never forget. The meeting occurred the morning of the day that the NBA shut down their games. So we met that morning. We actually had a plan in place. Come that evening, I believe it was a Thursday evening, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was Wednesday evening into Thursday. We decided, you know what, let's get this in place for two reasons. One, we have to protect our employees. It's only fair to them. So a lot of the provisions that we put in place were provisions that ultimately we saw at both at the state and local level. But also for us, it's because we have employees that are handling materials and products are leaving our facility, we had to make sure that we're being safe for our consumers as well. So, one of the things, a good example is one of the processes that we implemented is we tried to limit the amount of employees that would handle any one SKU of product. So, if an issue arose, hopefully it was a little bit more easy for us to essentially contact trace back to a particular employee. These are all processes that we put in place early on, knowing full well that it was probably going to affect the business side of the operation, but it was only fair to our employees. It was only fair to our consumers to do that. So now unfortunately we have a small percentage, not small, a fairly decent sized percentage of our employees that have to show up every day because the essential portion of their job in this essential industry is building product for resale, for sale, right? So those employees unfortunately have been coming in every day, but everyone else, they've been working from home. And actually just 2 days ago, we just decided, regardless of what the city or state says, we are going to continue with this modified stay-at-home order that we've put in place for our own company until July 1. And then we'll take a look at it at that time and see what the state and the local authorities are saying. So again, it's about employees first and about consumer first.
That's great. And we do have a question I want to read off here in a second, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that, Carlos, and maybe just for a minute or two. What are you seeing in terms of the ethics impact for your organization during the quarantine period and the changes in business?
Logistically, it's a big privacy issue. Everything we do, we have two separate computer systems at the office. I have an Apple laptop that I work on, but if I want any client information, I have to go to a separate internal system that is not in any way connected to the outside world. So we had a privacy issue getting this all. And the other things were, since we proprietarily code everything ourselves, getting all the employees onto a VPN to work remotely was a bit of an issue. And one of the things I'll say is that there's also a sensitivity that, look, these are tough times. Like, our jobs are secure at my company, but our clients, are losing money in the market, potentially having issues with their jobs and things like that. And so I hope, I think I see it with our company, and I hope I see it generally, but sort of a time where everyone has to show a little bit of grace, and you'll get a fiery email from somebody, it's tough times, and so hopefully you don't fire one right back,
Yeah.
And I think it's part of ethics,
Excellent. Well, look, the question we have here, something you both triggered on earlier, and I think it got the attention of some of our attendees, is on this subject of on anti-money laundering. And the curiosity from the viewer is, where do the responsibilities for anti-money laundering lie within the organization? Are there monitoring processes or softwares in place? How is that being actually effectively handled within your organizations?
We have a huge department. Sorry, Eduardo. No, listen, we have a huge department. We have surveillance, computer surveillance programs. It is a hot spot in the financial services world, and so it was part of just the general compliance department, and recently we've expanded it and made it sort of a standalone, and it reports through compliance straight to the CEO.
Yeah, for our industry, it's actually all agency driven. In any state that you'll see with legalized some form of legalized marijuana, there's going to be a seed to sale tracking system that is essentially, it's contracted by the state regulatory body that literally it's RFID tagged plant seeds. So you can literally track a seed that grows into a plant that gets processed, that gets put into a finished product. It's that level of detail from the production side. As far as the money side, in order to even get a license, you have to have a facility that has undergone an incredible amount of security measures, including camera work, 100% coverage on camera for your facility. That's required to include a live look-in feature by the regulatory body. So at any point, the regulatory body can look into your facility and make sure that you are being compliant with whatever regulations. And that would obviously include as well in terms of money handling procedures as well. We're still a very cash-heavy business. We've come some way on some sort of banking solution, but we're still a very cash-heavy business. But in a lot of respects, it's and that was the intention, and that was one of the bargains every state made when they decided to legalize marijuana. Is there were a lot of provisions that were going to have to be put in place to protect against money laundering issues, for instance, and kind of gang related participation in a legalized form of the industry. So
interesting. Very, yeah, no, I was not aware of that. Very interesting. So look, we have additional questions, and I knew this was going to happen. You guys are too easy to talk to, so we're out of time. We've got a couple follow-up questions. So what's going to have to happen is you're going to have to both commit to come out to the symposium in 2021 and be part of it next year, so we can get into this a little bit more broadly. Before we close, I'd like to just ask either one of you, is there anything that you wanted to add to today's discussion briefly that we did not touch on? Maybe something that I did not ask that you'd like to throw in?
No, I mean, I want to thank you and thank Legility for having us. I feared this was going to turn into a Cuomo moment where, he's making fun of me for my cooking, or he's the favorite son or something like that. But that's been great. Really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And as I said earlier, and we've got still a couple more questions coming in. I'll read one more. If anybody has to drop, Sarah can disconnect me if she has to. But I love this. It's a quick question. Is there anything you could tell us that would be in the service of ethics and compliance that might surprise the audience that you've done? Something that they wouldn't expect.
From our perspective, I mean, there are a couple things. One of the, because of my role, I've been asked to be on a policy council. It's essentially a think tank for the National Cannabis Industry Association. And some of the things that we do is we actually engage the federal authorities. I was up in Boston before all the COVID-19 events happened, locked in a room with about 40 other people, including FDA, DEA, and local law enforcement authorities, to kind of have a very, very candid discussion about the illicit market. I mean, these are discussions that are happening that I think are important for our industry. You know, kind of on the state level, we get routinely contacted by the Marijuana Enforcement Division here in Colorado to, you know, when new states are thinking about bringing marijuana online, they have legislators that want to come out and see what it looks like, and they will contact us to say, hey, do you mind if we bring them by your facility, because we think your facility is a good representation of what the state's looking for. So we're in constant communication in more of a collaborative way than a combative way, which is I think unheard of in some industries.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to have to conclude today's session. I'm sorry I can't get to the rest of what we have, but I want to say thank you not only to both of you, but to all of our attendees. Thank you so much for participating with us today in this. It was a good, lively chat, good questions, great viewer participation. We really appreciate it. Sarah, before I close off, are there any final instructions you'd like to give?
No, so those are all the questions we have time for today. As you said, as a reminder, everyone who spoke today, we will have a recording available within the next day for anyone who had to step away, or if you'd like to share the content that was shared today with your colleagues. Thank you so much, speakers.
Eduardo, Carlos, thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.